All right. I am back with another read aloud series. Haven't done this in a while. I've mainly been focusing on gaming for my live streams. But a few years back, I did a read aloud for a series, a book called 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Hopefully, I'm remembering that right. Anyway, I have more time now because the pool closed down for the winter, basically. And so I've got more time to bring you a fresh series. I am very glad to bring you in another Read Aloud series. This time I'll be reading the Cider House Rules. Let's see here. By John Irving. And I will shoot to do one chapter per episode. I believe that's Tobey Maguire on the cover. Okay. YouTube, don't worry, don't fret. I'll still have Near Automata gameplay daily on Stormer Show. StormerShow for those that want to be in the know. Okay. Cider House Rules. Before I begin, I'll read some of the endorsements on the cover. There was, of course, a film released based on the book in 1999. And New York Times Book Review had this to say: witty, tender-hearted, fervent, and scarifying. This novel is an example, now rare, of the courage of imaginative ardor. Okay, here we go. So today I'll be beginning with chapter 1, The Boy Who Belonged to St. Cloud's. Cider House Rule. Yeah. The Boy Who Belonged to St. Cloud's. In the hospital of the orphanage, boys' division at St. Cloud's, Maine, two nurses were in charge of naming the new babies and checking that their little you know what's were healing from the obligatory vision. In those days, in 1920 blank, all boys born at St. Cloud's were circumcised because the orphanage physician had experienced some difficulty in treating uncircumcised soldiers. For this and for that in World War One. The doctor, who was also the director of the boys' division, was not a religious man. Circumcision was not a right with him. It was a strictly medical act, performed for hygienic reasons. His name was Wilbur Lark, which, except for the scent ether that always accompanied him, reminded one of the nurses of the tough, durable wood of the coniferous tree of that name. She hated, however, the ridiculous name of Wilbur, and took offense at the silliness of combining a word like Wilbur with something as substantial as a tree. The other nurse imagined herself to be in love with Dr. Larch, and it was her turn to name a baby. She frequently named him John Larch. For John Wilbur, her father's name was John, or Wilbur Walsh. Her mother's maiden name had been Walsh. Despite her love for Dr. Larch, she could not imagine Larch as anything but a last name. And when she thought of him, she did not think of trees at all. His flexibility as a first or a last name, she loved the name of Wilbur. And when she tired of her use of John, or was criticized by her colleague for overusing it, she could rarely come up with anything more original than a Robert Larch or Jack Wilbur. He seemed not to know that Jack was often a nickname for John. If he had been named by this dull, love-struck nurse, he probably would have been a Larch or Wilbur of one kind or another. And a John, Jack, or Robert, to make matters even duller. Because it was the other nurse's turn. He was named Homer Wells. The other nurse's father was in the business of drilling wells, which was hard, harrowing, honest, precise work. We are thinking her father was composed of these qualities, which lent the word Wells a certain deep, down-to-earth aura. Homer had been the name of one of her family's umpteen cats. Southern Nurse Angela, to almost everyone, rarely repeated the names of her babies, whereas poor Nurse Edna had named 3 John Wilbur Jr.'s and 2 John Larch III's. Nurse Angela knew an inexhaustible number of no-nonsense nouns, which she diligently employed as last names. Maple, Fields, Stone, Hill, Knott, A, Waters, to list a few. And a slightly less impressive list of first names borrowed from a family history of many dead but cherished pets. Felix, Fuzzy, Smokey, Sam, Snowy, Joe, Curly, Ed, and so forth. For most of the orphans, of course, these nurse-given names were temporary. The boys' division had a better record than the girls' division at placing the orphans in homes when they were babies. Too young ever to know the names their good nurses had given them. Most of the orphans wouldn't even remember Nurse Angela or Nurse Edna, the first woman in the world to fuss over them. Dr. Larch made it a firm policy that the orphans' adoptive families not be informed of the names the nurses gave with such zeal. The feeling at St. Cloud's was that a child, upon leaving the orphanage, should know the thrill of a fresh start. Especially with the boys who were difficult to place and lived at St. Cloud's the longest, it was hard for Nurse Angela and Nurse Edna, and even for Dr. Larch, not to think of their John Wilburs and John Larches, their Felix Hills, Curly Maples, Joe Knotts, Smoky Waterses, as possessing their nurse-given names forever. The reason Homer Wells kept his name was that he came back to St. Cloud so many times after so many failed foster homes that the orphanage was forced to acknowledge Homer's intention to make St. Cloud's his home. It was not easy for anyone to accept. The Nurse Angela and Nurse Edna, and finally Dr. Wilbur Larch, were forced to admit that Homer Wells belonged to St. Cloud's. The determined boy was not to put up for adoption anymore. Nurse Angela, with her love of cats and orphans, once remarked of Homer Wells that the boy must adore the name she gave him because he fought so hard not to lose it. St. Cloud's, Maine. The town had been a logging camp for most of the 19th century. The camp and gradually the town set up shop in the river valley. But the land was flat, which made the first roads easier to build and heavy equipment easier to transport. The first building was a sawmill. First settlers were French Canadians. Woodsmen, lumberjacks, sawyers. Then came the overland haulers and the river bargemen. Then the prostitutes, then the vagrants, and the thugs, and at last there was a church. First logging camp had been called simply Clouds, because the valley was low and the clouds broke up reluctantly. The fog hung over the violent river until mid-morning, and the falls, which roared for 3 miles upstream from the first side of the first camp, produced a constant mist. When the first woodcutters went to work there, the only impediments to their taking of the forest, I'll try to omit some of the things that I think might be too risque for social media, were the black flies and mosquitoes. These infernal insects preferred the nearly constant cover of clouds in stagnant valleys of inland Maine, to the sharp air of the mountains, or to the crisp sunlight by the bright Maine sea. Dr. Wilbert Larch, who was not the only doctor for the orphanage and the director of the boys' division, he had also founded the place, was the self-appointed historian of the town. According to Dr. Larch, the logging camp called Clouds became St. Cloud's only because of the fervent backwoods Catholic instinct to put a saint before so many things, as if to grant those things a grace they can never quite acquire naturally. The logging camp remained St. Cloud's for nearly half a century before the apostrophe was inserted, probably by someone who was unaware of the camp's origin. But by the time it became St. Cloud's, it was more of a mill town than a logging camp. Forest for miles around was cleared, instead of logs jamming the river, and the rough camp full of men, lamed and crippled by falling from trees or by trees falling on them. One saw the high, orderly stacks of fresh cut boards drying out in the hazy sun. Over all lay a silty sawdust occasionally too fine to see, but ever present in the sneezes and wheezes of the town. The town's perpetually itching noses and in its rasping lungs. The town's wounded now sported stitches instead of bruises and broken bones. They wore gashes, found ways to flaunt their missing parts from the mill's many saws. Keen one of those blades was as constant in St. Cloud's as the fog, mist, the humidity that overhangs inland Maine and the damp cold of its long, wet, snowed-in winters and in the fetid, stifling heat of its drizzly summers, blessed only occasionally by violent thunderstorms. There's never any spring in that part of Maine, except that period of time in March and April, distinguished by thawing mud. Heavy equipment of the lumbering business was immobilized. Work of the town shut down. The impassable roads kept everyone at home. The springtime river was so swollen, ran so fast, no one dared to travel on it. Spring in St. Cloud's meant trouble. Drinking trouble, brawling trouble, and other unfortunate kinds of trouble. Spring was the suicide season. In spring, the seeds for an orphanage were planted and overplanted. And what of the fall? In his journal, his whatnot diary, his daily record of the business of the orphanage, Dr. Wilbur wrote of the fall. Each of Dr. Larch's entries began here in St. Cloud's, except for those entries that began in other parts of the world. Of the fall, Dr. Larch wrote, in other parts of the world, fall is for the harvest. One gathers the fruits of spring and summer's labors. These fruits provide for the long slumber and the season of ungrowing that is called winter. Here in St. Cloud's, the fall is only 5 minutes long. What sort of climate would anyone expect for an orphanage? Can anyone imagine resort weather? Would an orphanage bloom in an innocent town? In his journal, Dr. Larch was demonstratively conservative with paper. He wrote in a small, cramped hand on both sides of the pages, which were absolutely filled. Dr. Larch was not a man for leaving margins. Here in St. Cloud's, he wrote, guess who's the enemy of the Maine forest? The villainous father of the unwanted babies, the reason the river is choked with deadwood and the valley land stripped, unplanted, eroded by the river floods. Guess who is the insatiable destroyer? First of a logger with his hands pitchy and his fingers mashed, then of a lumberman, sawmill slave whose hands are dry and cracked, some fingers only in memory. And guess why this glutton is not satisfied with logs or with lumber? It's who? To Dr. Larch, the enemy was paper, specifically the Ramsey's Paper Company. There were enough trees for lumber, Dr. Larch imagined, but there would never be enough trees for all the paper the Ramsey's Paper Company seemed to want or need, especially if one failed to plant new trees. The valley surrounding St. Cloud's was cleared, and the second growth, scrub pine and random, unmanaged softwoods, sprang up everywhere, like swampweed, and when there were no more logs to send downriver from 3 Mile Falls to St. Cloud's, because there were no more trees, that was when the Ramsey's Paper Company introduced Maine to the 20th century by closing down the sawmill and the lumber yard along the river at St. Cloud's and moving camp downstream. And what was left behind? The weather, the sawdust, the scarred, bruised bank of the river, where the big log drives jamming, gouged out a raw new shore. And the buildings themselves, the mill with its broken windows with no screens, hotel with its dance hall downstairs, and the bingo for money room overlooking the rough river. Few private homes, log cabin style, and the church, which was Catholic, for the French Canadians, which looked too clean and unused to belong to St. Cloud's, where it had never been half as popular as the ladies, or the dance hall, or even bingo for money. In Dr. Larch's journal, he wrote, in other parts of the world they play tennis or poker, but here in St. Cloud's they play bingo for money. And the people who were left behind? There were no Ramsey's Paper Company people left behind. There were people. the older and less attractive ladies, the children of those ladies. Not one of the neglected officers of the Catholic Church of St. Cloud stayed. There were more souls to save by following the Ramses Paper Company downstream. In his brief history of St. Cloud's, Dr. Larch documented with at least one of these ladies that they knew how to read and write. The last barge downriver followed the Ramses Paper Company to a new civilization. A relatively literate lady sent a letter addressed to whichever official of the state of Maine who's concerned with orphans. Somehow this letter actually reached someone. Forwarded many times for its curiosity, Dr. Larch wrote, as much as for its urgency. The letter was delivered to the State Board of Medical Examiners. The youngest member of this board, the puppy right out of medical school, as Dr. Larch described himself, was shown the letter as a kind of bait. The rest of the board thought the young Larch was the one hopelessly naive, Democrat and liberal among them. The letter said, there should be a doctor, there should be a school, and even a policeman, and a lawyer in St. Cloud's, which has been deserted by its men, but never much, and left to helpless women and orphans. The chairman of the State Board of Medical Examiners was a retired physician who thought that President Teddy Roosevelt was the only other man in the world besides himself who had not been made from a banana. Why don't you look into this much, Larch? The chairman said, little knowing that out of this invitation, a state-supported facility for orphans would soon develop. Would one day gain at least partial federal support, and even that most vague and least dependable support offered by private benefactors. Anyway, in 1900, as the 20th century, so young and full of promise, blossomed even in inland Maine, Dr. Wilbur Larch undertook the task of righting the wrongs of St. Cloud's. He had his work cut out for him. For almost 20 years, Dr. Larch would leave St. Cloud's only once, World War I, where it's doubtful he was more needed. What better man could be imagined for the job of undoing what the Ramses Paper Company had done than a man named after one of the world's coniferous trees? In his journal, as he was only beginning, Dr. Larch wrote, here in St. Cloud's, it's high time something was done for the good of someone. What better place for improvement could there be? For self-improvement, and for the good of all. And a place where evil has so clearly flourished, if not altogether triumphed. In 1920, when Homer Wells was born and had his little so-and-so snipped and was named Nurse Edna, who was in love, and Nurse Angela, who wasn't, had in common a pet name of their own of St. Cloud's founder, physician, town historian, war hero. He was even decorated, and director of the boys' division. Saint Larch, they called him. Why not? When Wilbur Larch granted Homer Wells permission to remain at St. Cloud's for as long as the boy felt he belonged there, the doctor was merely exercising his considerable and earned authority. St. Larch had found his place, in the 20th century, to be, as he put it, of use. And that is precisely how Dr. Larch instructed Homer Wells, and the doctor sternly accepted the boy's need to stay at St. Cloud's. Well then, Homer, said St. Larch, I expect you to be of use. He was nothing, Homer Wells, if not of use. His sense of usefulness appears to predate Dr. Larch's instructions. His first foster parents returned him to St. Cloud's. They thought there was something wrong with him. He never cried. Foster parents complained that they would wake to the same silence that had prompted them to adopt the child in the first place. They'd wake up alarmed that the baby hadn't woken them. They'd rush into the baby's room expecting to find him dead, but Homer Wells would be toothlessly biting his lip, perhaps grimacing, not protesting that he was unfed and unattended. Homer's foster parents always suspected that he'd been awake, quietly suffering for hours. They thought this wasn't normal. Dr. Larch explained to them that the babies of St. Cloud's were used to lying in their beds unattended. Nurse Angela and Nurse Edna, dearly devoted though they were, not be rushing to each and every baby the second it cried. Not be rushing to each and every baby. Crying was not of much use at St. Cloud's. Though in his heart of hearts, Dr. Larch knew very well that Homer's capacity for withholding tears was unusual, even for an orphan. It was Dr. Larch's experience that foster parents who could so easily be deterred from wanting a baby were not the best parents for an orphan. Homer's first foster parents were so quick to assume they'd been given a wrong one, retarded, and lemon brain dead, brain damaged, that Dr. Larch didn't even extend himself to assure them that Homer was a very fit baby, bound to have a courageous long haul in the life ahead. The second foster family responded differently to Homer's lack of sound. His stiff upper lip and bite the bullet while just lying there placidity. His second foster family beat the baby so regularly that they managed to get some appropriately baby-like noise out of him. Homer's crying saved him. He'd proven himself to be stalwart at resisting tears. Now when he saw that tears and howls and shrieks seemed to be what his foster family most desired of him, he tried to be of use and gave with his whole heart the lustiest wails he could deliver. He'd been such a creature of contentment. Dr. Larch was surprised to learn that the new baby from St. Cloud's was disturbing the peace in the fortunately small and nearby town of 3 Mile Falls. It's fortunate that 3 Mile Falls was small, because the stories of Homer's cries were the center of the area's gossip for several weeks. It's fortunate that 3 Mile Falls was nearby, because the stories found their way to St. Cloud's and to Nurse Angela and Nurse Edna, who would concern the gossip market and all those river, wood, and paper towns. When they heard the tales of how their Homer Wells was keeping 3 Mile Falls awake until the small hours, and how he would wake up the town before it was light, the nurse's good memories did not forsake them. They went straight to St. Larch. "That's not my Homer," Nurse Angela cried. "He's not a natural at crying, Wilbur," Nurse Edna said, taking every opportunity she had to pronounce that name so dear to her heart. Wilbur. It always made Nurse Angela cross with her, whenever Nurse Edna indulged her desire to call Dr. Larch Wilbur to his face. "Dr. Larch," Nurse Angela said, with pointed and excessive formality. "If Homer Wells is waking up 3 Mile Falls, that family you let have him must be burning that boy with their cigarettes. We weren't that kind of family." That was a favorite fantasy of Nurse Angela's. She hated smoking. She just the look of a cigarette dangling from anyone's mouth made her remember a French-speaking Indian who'd come to see her father about digging a well and had stuck his cigarette in one of her cat's faces, burning its nose. The cat, an especially friendly spayed female, had jumped up in the Indian's lap. The cat had been named Bandit. He'd had the classic masked face of a raccoon. Nurse Angela had restrained herself from naming any of the orphans after Bandit. He thought of Bandit as a girl's name. The family from 3 Mile Falls were not sadists of a very known kind. An older man and his younger wife lived with his grown-up children of a previous marriage. The young wife wanted a child of her own, but she couldn't get pregnant. Everyone in the family thought it would be nice for the young wife to have her own baby. What no one mentioned was that one of the grown-up children from the previous marriage had had a baby illegitimately, and she hadn't cared for it very well. The baby had cried and cried and cried. Everyone complained about the baby crying, night and day. One morning, the grown-up daughter had simply taken her baby and gone. She left only one note behind. "I'm sick of hearing from all of you about how much my baby cries. I guess if I go, you won't miss the crying, or me either." But they did miss the crying. Everyone missed that wonderful bawling baby, and the dear, dim-witted daughter who had taken it away. "It's sure nice to have a baby crying around here again," someone in the family had remarked. So they went and got themselves a baby from St. Cloud's. They were the wrong family to be given a baby who wouldn't cry. Homer's silence was such a disappointment to them that they took it as a kind of affront and challenged each other to discover who among them could make the baby cry first. After first, they progressed to loudest. After loudest came longest. They first made him cry by not feeding him, but they made him cry loudest by hurting him. This usually meant pinching him or punching him, but there was ample evidence that the baby had been bitten too. They made him cry longest by frightening him. They discovered that startling babies was the best way to frighten them. They must have been very accomplished at achieving the loudest and longest in order to have made Homer Wells crying a legend in 3 Mile Falls. It was especially hard to hear anything in 3 Mile Falls, not to mention how hard it was to make a legend out of anything there. Falls themselves made such a steady roar that 3 Mile Falls was the perfect town for murder. No one there could hear a shot or scream. If you murdered someone in 3 Mile Falls and threw the body in the river at the falls, the body couldn't possibly be stopped or even slowed down, not to mention found, until it went 3 miles downriver to St. Cloud's. It was therefore all the more remarkable that the whole town never heard. It was therefore all the more remarkable that the whole town heard the crying of Homer Wells. It took Nurse Angela and Nurse Edna about a year before Homer Wells stopped waking up with a scream, or letting out a wail whenever someone crossed his field of vision, whenever he heard a human sound, even a chair being dragged across the floor, or even a bed creak, a window shut, a door open. Every sight and sound connected with a human being who might possibly be headed in Homer's direction produced a high, stammering shout, and such a tearful blubbering that anyone visiting the boy's division would have thought that the orphan was, in fairy tale fashion, a torture shop, prison of child abuse, and abuse beyond imagining. Homer, Homer, Dr. Larch would say soothingly, while the boy burned scarlet and refilled his lungs. Homer, you're going to get us investigated for murder. You're going to get us shut down. Poor Nurse Edna and Nurse Angela were probably more permanently scarred by the family from 3 Mile Falls than Homer Wells was, and the good and the great St. Larch never fully recovered from the incident. He had met the family, he'd interviewed them all, had been horribly wrong about them. He'd seen them all again on the day he went to 3 Mile Falls to bring Homer Wells back to St. Cloud's. What Dr. Larch would always remember was the fright in all of their expressions when he'd marched into their house and taken Homer up in his arms. The fear in their faces would haunt Dr. Larch forever, the epitome of everything he could never understand about the great ambiguity in the feelings people had for children. There was the human body, which was so clearly designed to want babies. And then there was the human mind, which was so confused about the matter. Sometimes the mind didn't want the babies. But sometimes the mind was so perverse it made other people have babies they knew they didn't want. For whom was this insisting done? Dr. Larch wondered. For whom did some minds insist babies, even clearly unwanted ones, must be brought screaming into the world? And when other minds thought they wanted babies, but then they couldn't or wouldn't take proper care of them, well, what were these minds thinking? When Dr. Larch's mind ran away with him on the subject, it was always the fear in those faces of the family from 3 Mile Falls that he saw, the Homer Wells legendary howl that he heard. The fear in that family was fixed in St. Larch's vision. No one, he believed, who had seen such fear should ever make a woman have a baby she didn't want to have. No one, Dr. Larch wrote in his journal. Not even someone from the Ramses Paper Company. If you had an ounce of sanity, you would not speak against abortion to Dr. Wilbur Larch, but you would suffer every detail there was to know about the 6 weeks Homer Wells spent with the family from 3 Mile Falls. This was Larch's only way of discussing the issue. It was not even open to debate with him. He was an obstetrician, but when he was asked, and when it was safe, he was an abortionist too. By the time Homer was 4, he didn't have those dreams anymore. The ones that could awaken every living soul in St. Cloud's. The dreams that caused one night watchman to resign. My heart, he said, won't take another night of that boy. And that resided so soundly in the memory of Dr. Wilbur Larch that he was known, for years, to hear babies crying in his sleep, and roll over saying, Homer, Homer, it's all right now, Homer. At St. Cloud's, of course, babies were always crying in everyone's sleep. No baby ever woke up crying in quite the manner that Homer Wells managed it. Lord, it's as if he's being stabbed, I would say. As if he was being burned with a cigarette, Nurse Angela would say. But only Wilbur Larch knew what it was really like, the way that Homer Wells woke up, in his violent waking, everyone else. As if he was being circumcised, Dr. Larch wrote in his journal. As if someone were snipping his you know what over and over again, just snipping it. The third foster family to fail with Homer Wells was a family of such rare and championship qualities that to judge humanity by this family's example would be foolish. They were that good a family. They were that perfect, or Dr. Larch would not have let Homer go to them. After the family from 3 Mile Falls, Dr. Larch was being especially careful with Homer. Professor Draper and his wife of nearly 40 years lived in Waterville, Maine. Waterville was not much of a college town in 1930 when Homer Wells went there. But if you compared Waterville to St. Cloud's or to 3 Mile Falls, you'd have to say that Waterville was a community of moral and social giants. Though still inland, it was of considerably higher elevation. There were nearby mountains, and from these there were actual vistas. Mountain life, like life on an ocean, or on the plains, or on an open farmland, affords the inhabitant the luxury of a view. Living on land where you can occasionally see a long way provides the soul with a perspective of a beneficially expansive nature. Or so believed Professor Draper. He was a born teacher. Unfarmed valley land, he would intone, which I associate with forests too low and too dense to provide a view, tends to cramp the uplifting qualities of human nature and enhance those instincts which are mean-spirited and small. Now Homer, Mrs. Draper would say, Professor is a born teacher. You have to take him with a grain of salt. Everyone called her mom. No one, including his grown children and his grandchildren, called him anything but Professor. Even Dr. Larch didn't know what his first name was. His tone was very professorial, at times even officious. He was a man of very regular habits and temperament, and his manner was jocular. Wet shoes, the professor once said to Homer, are a fact of Maine. They are a given. Your method, Homer, of putting wet shoes on a windowsill where they might be dried by the faint appearance, albeit rare, of the Maine sun, is admirable for its positivism, its determined optimism. However, the professor would go on, the method I would recommend for wet shoes, a method, I must add, that is independent of the weather, involves a more reliable source of heat in Maine, namely the furnace. When you consider that the days when shoes get wet are days, as a rule, when you don't see the sun, recognize the furnace-filled room as having certain advantages. With a grain of salt, Homer, Miss Draper would tell the boy. Even the professor called her mom. Even mom called him professor. The grain of salt, Homer, Miss Draper would tell the boy. Even the professor called her mom. Even mom called the professor. Homer Wells found the professor's conversation abounding in the maxims. He didn't complain. Professor Draper's students at the college and his colleagues in the history department thought that the professor was a sententious bore, intended to flee his path like rabbits escaping the slow but nose to the ground hound. It could not influence Homer's opinion of the first father figure in his life, rival Dr. Larch. Homer's arrival in Waterville was greeted by the kind of attention the boy had never known. Nurse Angela and Nurse Edna were emergency providers, Dr. Larch an affectionate, if stern and distracted overseer. But Mrs. Draper was a mom's mom. She was a hoverer. She was up before Homer was awake. Cookies she baked while he ate his breakfast were miraculously still warm in his lunch bag at noon. Mom Draper hiked to school with Homer. They went overland, disdaining the road. It was her constitutional, she said. In the afternoons, Professor Draper met Homer in the school's playground. School's end seemed magically timed to coincide with the professor's last class of the day at the college, and they would tramp home together. In the winter, which in Waterville came early, this was a literal tramping on snowshoes, the mastery which the professor placed on the level of learning to read and write. Use the body, use the mind, Homer, the professor said. It's easy to see why Wilbur Larch was impressed with the man. He vigorously represented usefulness. In truth, Homer liked the routine of it, the tramp, tramp, tramp of it, and utter predictability of it. An orphan is simply more of a child than other children, that essential appreciation of the things that happen daily on schedule. For everything that promises to last, stay the same, the orphan is a sucker. Dr. Larch ran the boys' division with as many of the simulated manifestations of daily life as are possible to cultivate in an orphanage. Meals were promptly served at the same time every day. Dr. Larch would read aloud at the same evening hour for the same length of time, even if it meant leaving a chapter in mid-adventure, with the boy shouting, "More, more! Just read the next thing that happens." St. Large would say, "Tomorrow, same time, same place." There'd be groans of disappointment. But Larch knew that he made a promise. He'd established a routine. Here in St. Cloud's, he wrote in his journal, security is measured by the number of promises kept. Every child understands a promise, if it is kept, and looks forward to the next promise. Among orphans, you build security slowly but regularly. Slow but regular would describe the life that Homer Wells led with the Drapers in Waterville. Every activity was a lesson. Each corner, the comfortable old house, held something to be learned and then counted upon. This is Rufus. He's very old, Professor would say, introducing Homer to the dog. This is Rufus's rug. This is his kingdom. When Rufus is sleeping on his kingdom, do not wake him, unless you're prepared for him to snap. Whereupon the professor would rouse the ancient dog, who would snap awake, and then appeared puzzled over the area to be bitten, tasting in it the Drapers' grown-up children, now married and with children of their own. Homer met them all for Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving with the Drapers was an experience in family guaranteed to make other families feel inferior. Mom would outdo herself at momness. The professor had a lecture ready on every conceivable subject: qualities of white meat and of dark, last election, the pretension of salad forks, the superiority of the late 19th century novel, not to mention other aspects of that century's superiority. Proper texture of cranberry sauce, the meaning of repentance, wholesomeness of exercise, including a comparison between splitting wood and ice skating, the evil inherent in naps. Each laboriously expressed opinion of the professors, his grown children, 2 married women, 1 man, would respond with a fairly balanced mixture of, "Just so. Isn't that always the way? Try it again, Professor." These robot-like responses were punctuated with equal precision by Mom's oft-repeated grain of salt, grain of salt. Homer Wells listened to these steady rhythms like a visitor from another world, trying to decipher a strange tribe's drums. He couldn't quite catch on. The seeming constancy of everyone was overwhelming. He wouldn't know until he was much older, which it was that didn't set well with him. The implicit and explicit and self-congratulatory do-gooderism, or the hardiness in which life was tediously oversimplified. Whichever it was, he stopped liking it. It became an obstacle in the path he was looking for that led to himself, to who he was or should be. He remembered various Thanksgivings at St. Cloud's. They were not so cheery as the Waterville Thanksgiving with the Draper family, but they seemed a lot more real. He remembered how he had felt of use. There were always babies who couldn't feed themselves. There was the likelihood of a snowstorm that would knock out the electricity. Homer was put in charge of the candles and the kerosene lamps. He was also in charge of helping the kitchen staff clear, helping Nurse Angela and Nurse Edna comfort the crying, of being Dr. Larch's messenger, the most prized responsibility that was conferred in the boys' division. Before he was 10, long before, To be given such explicit instruction from Dr. Larch, Homer felt full of usefulness at St. Cloud's. What was it about Thanksgiving at the Drapers that contrasted so severely with the same event at St. Cloud's? Mom had no match as a cook. It couldn't have been food, which St. Cloud suffered from a visible and seemingly terminal grayness. Was it the saying of grace? St. Cloud's grace was a rather blunt instrument, Dr. Larch not being a religious man. Let us be thankful, he would say, and then pause, as if he were truly wondering what for. Let us be thankful for what kindness we have received, Larch would say, cautiously looking at the unwanted and abandoned around him. Let us be thankful for Nurse Angela and for Nurse Edna, he would add with more assurance in his voice. Let us be thankful that we've got options, that we've got second chances, he added once, looking at Homer Wells. The event of grace at Thanksgiving at St. Cloud's was shrouded with chance, with understandable caution, with typically Larch-like reserve. The event of grace at Thanksgiving at St. Cloud's was shrouded with chance. Grace at the Drapers was effusive and strange. It seemed somehow connected with the professor's definition of the meaning of repentance. Professor Draper said that the start of real repentance was to accept yourself as vile. For grace, the professor cried out, "Say after me, I am vile. I abhor myself, but I am thankful for everyone in my family." They all said so, even Homer, even Mom, for once withheld a recommended grain of salt. St. Cloud's was a sober place, but its manner of giving what little thanks it could seem frank, sincere. Some contradiction in the Draper family occurred to Homer Wells for the first time at Thanksgiving. Unlike St. Cloud's, life in Waterville seemed good. Babies, for example, were wanted. Where did repentance come from then? Was there guilt attached to feeling lucky? And if Larch, as Homer had been told, was named from a tree, God, whose Homer heard a lot about in Waterville, seemed to be named from even tougher stuff. Maybe from mountain, maybe from ice. If God was sobering Waterville, Draper Thanksgiving was, to Homer's surprise, a drunken occasion. The professor was, in Mom's words, in his cups. This, Homer deduced, meant that the professor had consumed more than his normal daily amount of alcohol, which, in Mom's words, made him only tipsy. Homer was shocked to see the two married daughters and the married son behave as if they were in their cups too. And since Thanksgiving was special and he was allowed to stay up late with all the grandchildren, Homer observed that nightly occurrence he had previously only heard as he was falling asleep. Thudding, dragging, shuffling sound, and the muffled voice of reason. It was the professor slurring his protest for the fact that Mom forcibly assisted him upstairs and with astonishing strength lifted him too and deposited him upon the bed. "Value of exercise," shouted the grown and married son before toppling from the green chaise and collapsing upon the rug beside old Rufus as if he'd been poisoned. "Like father, like son," said one of the married daughters. The other married daughter, Homer noted, had nothing to say. She slept peacefully in the rocking chair. Her whole hand, above the second knuckle joints, was submerged in her nearly full drink, which rested precariously in her lap. The unmanaged grandchildren violated the house's million rules. The professor's passionate readings of various riot acts were seemingly ignored for Thanksgiving. Homer Wells, not even 10, quietly to his bed. Invoking an especially sad memory of St. Cloud's was a way he frequently forced sleep upon himself. What he remembered was the time he saw the mothers leaving the orphanage hospital, which was within view of the girls' division, which adjoined the boys' division. They were architecturally linked by a long shed, formerly a storage room for spare blades, to the circular saw. It was early morning, but it was still dark out, and Homer needed the coach lights in order to see it was snowing. He slept badly and was often awake for the arrival of the coach. He came from the railroad station and delivered to St. Cloud's the kitchen and cleaning staff and the first hospital shift. The coach was simply an abandoned railroad car, set on sled runners in the winter. It was a converted sleigh pulled by horses. There wasn't enough snow on the dirt road. Sled runners struck sparks against the stones in the ground and made a terrible grating noise. Reluctant to change the runners for wheels until they knew the winter was over. Bright light, like a flare, sputtered by the heavily blanketed driver on the makeshift carriage seat. Softer lights winked inside the coach car. This morning, Homer noted, there were women waiting in the snow to be picked up by the coach. Homer Wells didn't recognize the women, which he did the whole time it took St. Cloud's staff to unload. There seemed to be a certain tension between these groups. Women waiting to board appeared shy, even ashamed. Men and women coming to work seemed, by comparison, arrogant, even superior. And one of them, who was a woman, made a rough remark to the women waiting to leave. Homer couldn't hear the remark, but its effect drove the waiting women away from the coach like a blast of the winter wind. Women who boarded the coach did not look back or even at each other. They didn't even speak, and the driver, who struck Homer as a friendly man, with something to say to nearly everyone in any weather, had no words for them. The coach simply turned around and glided across the snow to the station. In the lit windows, Homer Wells could see that several of the women had their faces in their hands, or sat as stonily as the other kind of mourner at a funeral. The one who must assume an attitude of total disinterest, or else risk total loss of control. He had never before seen the mothers who had their unwanted babies at St. Cloud's and then left them there. He didn't see them very clearly this time. It was unquestionably more meaningful that he first saw them as they were taking their leave than arriving, full-bellied and undelivered of their problems. Importantly, Homer knew they did not look delivered of all their problems when they left. No one had seen looked more miserable than those women. No one he had seen looked more miserable. He suspected it was no accident that they left in the darkness. He tried to put himself to sleep. Thanksgiving with the Drapers and Waterville. Homer Wells saw the mothers leaving in the snow, but he also saw more than he'd actually seen. On the nights he couldn't sleep, Homer rode in the coach to the station with the women. He boarded the train with them. He went to their homes with them. He singled out his mother and followed her. It was hard to see what she looked like and where she lived, where'd she'd come from, if she'd gone back there, and harder still was to imagine who his father was, and if she went back to him. Like most orphans, Homer Wells imagined that he saw his missing parents often, but he was always unrecognized by them. As a child, he was embarrassed to be caught staring at adults, sometimes affectionately, other times with an instinctual hostility he would have not recognized in his own face. "You stop it, Homer," Dr. Larch used to say to him at those times. "You just cut it out." As an adult, Homer Wells would still get caught staring. But on Thanksgiving night in Waterville, he stared so hard into his real parents' lives that he almost found them before he fell asleep, exhausted. He was abruptly awakened by one of the grandchildren as an older boy. Homer had forgotten he was going to share his bed with him because the house was crowded. "Moreover," the boy said. "Move over," the boy said. Homer moved over. "Keep your pajamas on," the boy told Homer, who had no intention of taking his clothes off. "You know what buggering is?" the boy asked. "No," Homer said. "Yes, you do," the boy said. "That's what you all do at St. Cloud's. Bugger. All the time, I'm telling you. Try to bug me, and you'll go back there without your finger." The boy said, "I'll cut off your finger and feed it to the dog." "You mean Rufus?" Wells asked. "Right," said. "You want to tell me again you don't know what bugging is?" "I don't know," Homer said. "Want me to show you, don't you?" the boy asked. "I don't think so," Homer said. "Yes, you do," the boy said. Then he tried to bug Homer Wells. Homer had never seen or heard of anyone being so abused at St. Cloud's. Although the older boy had learned his style of bugging at a private school, a very good one, he had never been educated in the kind of crying that Homer Wells had been taught by the family from 3 Mile Falls. It seemed to Homer that it was a good time for crying. Loudly, one wanted to escape the bugging, and his crying immediately awakened the one adult in the Draper household who had merely gone to sleep, as opposed to passing out. In other words, Homer woke Mom. He woke all the grandchildren, too. And since several of them were younger than Homer, all of them had no knowledge of Homer's capacity for howls, his crying produced sheer terror among them, and even aroused Rufus, who snapped. "What in heaven's name?" Mom asked, at Homer's door. He tried to bug me, so I let him have it," said the private school boy. Homer, who was struggling to get his legendary howls under control, to send them back to history, didn't know the grandchildren are believed before orphans. "Here in St. Cloud's," wrote Dr. Larch, "it is self-defeating and cruel to give much thought to ancestors. In other parts of the world, I'm sorry to say, an orphan's ancestors are always under suspicion." Mom hit Homer as hard as any representative of the failed family from 3 Mile Falls ever hit him. He then banished him to the furnace room for the remainder of the night. It was at least warm and dry there. And there was a fold-out cot, which in the summers she used for camping trips. There were also lots of wet shoes, a pair of which even belonged to Homer. Some of the wet socks were almost dry and fit him. The assortment of wet snowsuits and hardy tramping clothes gave Homer an adequate selection. He dressed himself in warm outdoor clothes, which were, for the most part, nearly dry. He knew that Mom and the professor thought too highly family ever to send him back to St. Cloud's over a mere bugging. He wanted to go back, and he did. He'd have to leave on his own initiative. In fact, Mom had provided Homer with a vision of how his alleged bugging would be treated and doubtlessly cured. She made him kneel before the fold-out cot in the furnace room. "Say after me," she said, and repeated the professor's strained version of grace. "I am vile, I abhor myself," said, and Homer had said it after her, knowing that every word was untrue. He never liked himself so much. He felt he was on track to finding out who he was, how he could be of use, but he knew the path led back to St. Cloud's. Mom kissed him good night. She said, "Now, Homer, don't mind what the professor has to say about this. Whatever he says, just take it with a grain of salt." Homer Wells didn't wait to hear the text of the professor's lesson regarding bugging. Homer stepped outside. Even the snow didn't stop him. In Waterville in 1930, it was no surprise to see so much snow on the ground for Thanksgiving. Professor Draper had very carefully instructed Homer on the merits and methods of snowshoeing. Homer was a good tramper. He found the town road fairly easily, and the bigger road after that. It was daylight when the first truck stopped. It was a logging truck. This seemed to Homer appropriate to where he was going. "I belong to St. Cloud's," he told the driver. "I got lost." 1930, every logger knew where St. Cloud's was. This driver knew it was in the other direction. "You're going the wrong way, kid," he advised the boy. "Turn around and look for a truck going the other way." "What are you, from St. Cloud's?" the driver asked. Like most people, he assumed the orphans were always running away from the orphanage, not running to it. "I just belong there," Homer Wells said. And the driver waved goodbye. In Dr. Larch's opinion, this driver, in order to be so insensitive as to let the boy go off alone in the snow, simply had to be an employee of the Ramsey's paper company. The next driver was also driving a logging truck. It was empty. He was heading back to the forest for more logs. St. Cloud's was more or less on the way. "You an orphan?" the driver asked Homer when he was going to St. Cloud's. "No," Homer said. "I just belong there, for now." 1930, it took a long time to drive anywhere in Maine, especially with snow on the road. It was growing dark when Homer Wells returned to his home. The quality of light was the same as the early morning when he'd seen the mothers leaving their babies behind. Homer stood at the hospital entrance for a while and watched the snow fall. Then he went back and stood outside the hospital entrance, because there was better light there. He was still thinking of exactly what to say to Dr. Larch when the coach from the railroad station, that unmerry sleigh, stopped at the hospital entrance and let out a single passenger. She was so pregnant that the driver at first concerned she might slip and fall. Then the driver appeared to realize why the woman had come here. It must have struck him as immoral that he should actually help a woman like that through the snow. He drove off and left her make her careful way toward the entrance, toward Homer Wells. Homer rang the bell at the entrance for the woman, who didn't seem to know what to do. It occurred to him that she was hoping for a little time to think what she too wanted to say to Dr. Larch. Anyone seen them there? This was a mother with her son. There's just that kind of familiarity in the way that they looked at each other, and the clear recognition between them. They knew perfectly well what the other was up to. Homer was worried what Dr. Larch would say to him. He realized that the woman was more worried than he was. The woman didn't know Dr. Larch. He had no idea what sort of place St. Cloud's was. More lights were turned on inside, and Homer recognized the divine shape of Nurse Angela coming to open the door. For some reason, he reached out and took the pregnant woman's hand. Maybe it was the tear frozen to her face that the new light had allowed him to see, but he wanted a hand to hold himself. He was calm, Homer Wells, as Nurse Angela peered into the snowy night in disbelief while she struggled to open the frozen door. To the pregnant woman and to her unwanted child, Homer said, "Don't worry. Everyone's nice here." He felt the pregnant woman squeeze his hand so hard that it hurt. The word mother strangely on his lips when Nurse Angela finally got the door open and seized Homer Wells in her arms. "Oh, oh," she cried. "Oh, Homer, my Homer, our Homer. I knew you'd be back." And because the pregnant woman's hand still firmly held Homer's hand, neither one of them felt able to let go. Nurse Angela turned and included the woman in her embrace. It seemed to Nurse Angela that the pregnant woman was just another orphan who belonged, like Homer Wells, exactly where she was. What he told Dr. Larch was that he'd felt of no use in Waterville. Because of what the Drapers had said, when they called Larch to say that Homer had run away, Homer had to explain about the bugging. Afterwards, St. Larch explained all about bugging Homer. The professor's drinking surprised Dr. Larch. He was good, as a rule, at detecting that. And the prayers baffled Larch. Dr. Larch's note to the Drapers was of a brevity that the professor's own language rarely allowed. "Repent," the note said. Larch might have left it at that, but he couldn't resist adding, "You were vile, and you should abhor yourselves." Wilbur Larch knew that a fourth foster family for Homer Wells would not easily be found. The search took Dr. Larch 3 years, by which time Homer was 12, almost 13. Larch knew what the danger would be. It would take Homer a great many years to feel as comfortable anywhere else as he'd felt at St. Cloud's. Here in St. Cloud's, Larch wrote in his journal, "we have only one problem. That there will always be orphans is not in the category of a problem. That is simply not to be solved. One does the best one can with that. One takes care of them. That our budget will always be too small is also not a problem. That won't be solved either. An orphan goes down to the wire. By definition, that is what should happen. And it is not a problem that every woman who gets pregnant doesn't necessarily want her baby. Perhaps we can look ahead to a more enlightened time, when women will have the right to abort the birth of an unwanted child. But some women will always be uneducated. They will always be confused. Will always be frightened. Even in enlightened times, unwanted babies will manage to be born. And there will always be babies who were very much unwanted, who were very much wanted, who will end up orphans by accident, by both planned and random acts of violence, which are not problems either. Here in St. Cloud's, we waste our limited energy and our limited imagination by regarding the sort of facts of life as if they were problems. Here in St. Cloud's, we have only one problem. His name is Homer Wells. We've been very successful with Homer. We managed to make the orphanage his home, and that is the problem. If you try to give an institution of the state or of any government anything like the love one is meant to invest in a family, if the institution is an orphanage and you succeed in giving it love, then you will create a monster. An orphanage that is not a way station to a better life, but an orphanage that is the first and last stop, and the only station that an orphan will accept. There is no excuse for cruelty, but in an orphanage, perhaps we're obliged to withhold love. If you fail to withhold love at an orphanage, you will create an orphanage that no orphan will willingly leave. You will create a Homer Wells, a true orphan, because his only home will always be at St. Cloud's. God, or whoever, forgive me. I made an orphan. His name is Homer Wells, and he'll belong to St. Cloud's forever. By the time Homer was 12, he had run the place. He knew its stoves and its wood boxes, its fuse boxes, its linen closets, its laundry room, its kitchen, its corners where the cat slept. When the mail came, who got any, everyone's name, who was on what shift, where the mothers went to be shaved when they arrived, how long the mothers stayed, when and with what necessary assistance they left. He knew the bells. In fact, he rang them. He knew who the tutors were. He could recognize their style of walking from the train station when they were still 200 yards away. He was even known at the girls' division, although the very few girls older than he was frightened him. He spent as little time there as he could, going only on errands for Dr. Larch, messages and delivering medicines. The director of the girls' division was not a doctor. When the girls were sick, either they visited Dr. Larch at the hospital or Larch went to the girls' division to visit them. The director of the girls' division was Boston Irish and worked for a while at the New England Home for Little Wanderers. Her name was Mrs. Grogan, although she never mentioned Mr. Grogan, and no one seeing her would have an easy time imagining that there had ever been a man in her life. She may have preferred the sound of Mrs. to the sound of Miss. At the New England Home for Little Wanderers, she had belonged to a society called God's Little Servants, which had given Dr. Large pause. But Mrs. Grogan showed no signs of seeking members for such a society in St. Cloud's. Perhaps she was too busy. In addition to her duties as director of the girls' division, she was responsible for arranging what little education was available for the orphans. If there was an orphan who remained at St. Cloud's, a sixth grade at school, there was no school to go to, and the only school for grades 1 through 6 was in 3 Mile Falls. This was only a one-station stop from the train station at Clouds, but in 1930 the trains were often delayed, and the Thursday engineer was notorious for forgetting to stop at St. Cloud Station. As if the sight of so many abandoned buildings convinced him that St. Cloud's was still a ghost town. Perhaps he disapproved of the women who got off the train there. The majority of the pupils in one-room schoolhouse in 3 Mile Falls thought themselves superior to the occasional orphans in attendance. This feeling prevailed the most strongly among those students who came from families where they were neglected or abused, or both, and thus grades 1 through 6 for Homer Wells were comprised of experiences more combative than educational. He missed 3 Thursdays out of 4 for years, at least one other day every week because of the late train. In winters, he missed a day a week because he was sick. And there was too much snow. The trains didn't run. The 3 tutors suffered the same perils pressed upon train service in those years, because they all came to St. Cloud's from 3 Mile Falls. There was a woman who taught math. She was a bookkeeper for a textile mill. A real-life accountant, Nurse Edna claimed, but she refused to have anything to do with algebra or geometry. She firmly preferred addition and subtraction and multiplication and division. Homer Wells would be a grown man before Dr. Larch would discover that the boy had never learned the multiplication table. Another woman, a well-to-do plumber's widow, taught grammar and spelling. Method was rigorous and messy. She presented great clumps of uncapitalized, misspelled, and unpunctuated words, and demanded that the clumps be put into proper sentences, meticulously punctuated and correctly spelled. She then corrected the corrections. Final document. She employed a system of different colored inks. It resembled a much revised treaty between two semi-literate countries at war. The text itself was always strange to Homer Wells, even when it was finally correct. This was because the woman borrowed heavily from a family hymnal. Homer Wells had never seen a church or heard a hymn, unless one counted Christmas carols. The songs Mrs. Grogan sang. The plumber's widow was not such a fool that she used Christmas carols. Homer Wells used to have nightmares about deciphering the passages that the plumber's widow concocted. The Lord me got when I in some wonder. Consider all the worlds the hens have made. Or there's this one. O rock of ages clift for me lit, he hid meself on thee. And so forth. The third tutor, a retired school teacher from Camden, was an old unhappy man who lived with his daughter's family because he couldn't take care of himself. He taught history, but he had no books. He taught the world from memory. He said the dates weren't important. He was capable of sustaining a rant about Mesopotamia for a full half hour. When he paused for breath or for a sip of water, he'd find himself in Rome or in Troy. He would recite long, uninterrupted passages and Thucydides, but a mere swallow would transport him to Elba with Napoleon. I think, Mercedna once remarked to Dr. Larch, that he manages to give a sense the scope of history. Nurse Angela rolled her eyes. Whenever I try to listen to him, she said, I can think of 100 good reasons for war. She meant Homer Wells understood that no one should live so long. It's easy to understand why Homer was more fond of doing chores than he was fond of education. Homer's favorite chore was selecting. Dr. Larch, the evening reading. He was supposed to estimate a passage would take Dr. Larch exactly 20 minutes to read. This was difficult because Homer read aloud to himself. He read more slowly than Dr. Larch. But when he simply read to himself at 20 minutes an evening, it took Dr. Larch several months to read Great Expectations and more than a year to read David Copperfield. At the end of which time, St. Larch announced to Homer that he would start at the beginning of Great Expectations. Again. Except for Homer, the orphans who'd first heard Great Expectations had moved on. Almost none of them understood Great Expectations or David Copperfield anyway. They were not only too young for the Dickensian language, they were also too young to comprehend the usual language of St. Cloud's. What mattered to Dr. Larch was the idea of reading aloud. It was a successful soporific for the children who didn't know what they were listening to. For those few who understood the words in the story, the evening reading provided them a way to leave St. Cloud's in their dreams, in their imaginations. Dickens was a personal favorite of Dr. Larch. It was no accident, of course, that both Great Expectations and David Copperfield were concerned with orphans. What in hell else would you read to an orphan? Dr. Larch inquired in his journal. So Homer Wells was familiar with the vision of what gibbet in the marshland, with some chains hanging to it which had once held a pirate. In Homer's imagination of the orphan, Pip, and the convict, Magwitch, the beautiful Estella, the vengeful Miss Havisham, provided him with sharper details. Falling asleep, he would follow the ghostly mothers who left St. Cloud's in the cover of darkness and boarded the horse-drawn coach car, or the later, the bus which replaced the coach, and gave Homer Wells his first sensation of the passage of time to progress. Soon after the bus replaced the coach, all bus service in St. Cloud's was discontinued. Thereafter, the mothers walked. This gave Homer further understanding of progress. The mothers he saw in his sleep never changed. The men who had not bothered to accompany them to St. Cloud's, where were they? Homer liked the part in Great Expectations when Pip is just starting out, and he says that the mist had all solemnly risen, and the world lay spread before me. The boy from St. Cloud's knew plenty about mists. They were what shrouded the river, town, orphanage itself, drifted downriver from 3 Mile Falls. They were what concealed one's parents. They were the clouds of St. Cloud's that allow one's parents to slip away unseen. Homer, Dr. Large would say, one day you'll get to see the ocean. You've only been as far as the mountains. They're not nearly as spectacular as the sea. There's fog on the coast. It can be worse than the fog here. And when the fog lifts, Homer, well, said St. Large, it's a moment you must see. But Homer Wells had already seen it. He had already imagined it, the mists, all solemnly risen. He smiled at Dr. Larch and excused himself. It was time to ring a bell. That was what he was doing. Bell ringing. When his fourth foster family arrived at St. Cloud's to fetch him. Dr. Larch had prepared him very well. Homer had no trouble recognizing the couple. They were, in today's language, sports-oriented. In Maine in 1930, when Homer Wells was 12, The couple who wanted to adopt him were simply thought fanatical about everything that could be done outdoors. They were a whitewater canoeing couple, an ocean sailing couple, mountain climbing, deep sea diving, wilderness camping couple, a 100-mile horse march pace tramping couple. Athletes, but not of an organized sport. They were not a sissy sport couple. The day they arrived at St. Cloud's, Homer Wells rang the bell for 10 o'clock 14 times. He was transfixed by them, by their solid muscular looks, by their loping strides, by his safari hat, her bushwhacking machete in a long sheath, with Indian beads at her belt. They both wore boots that looked lived in. Their vehicle was a homemade Pioneer, what would later years be called a camper, look equipped to handle and contain a rhino. Homer instantly foresaw that he would be made to hunt bears, wrestle alligators, in short, live off the land. Mercedes stopped him before he could ring 15 o'clock. Larch was being cautious. He didn't fear for Homer's mind. The boys read great expectations in David Copperfield by himself twice each, and had each word of both books read aloud to him, also twice, as more mentally prepared than most. Dr. Larch felt that the boy's physical or athletic development had been less certain. Sport seemed frivolous to Larch when compared to the learning of more necessary, more fundamental skills. Larch knew that the St. Cloud sports program, which consisted of indoor football in the dining hall when there was bad weather, was inadequate. In good weather, the boys and girls division played tag or kicked the can, or sometimes Nurse Edna and Nurse Angelus reached for stickball. The ball is composed of several socks wrapped in adhesive tape. It moved poorly. Larch had nothing against an outdoor life. He also knew nothing about one. He guessed that a little of its wasted Larch would be good for Homer. Possibly such physical activity might enhance the boy's sense of humor. The couple's name was a source of humor for Nurse Edna and Nurse Angela. Their married name was Winkle. He was called Grant, she was called Billy. They were members of Maine's very small money class. Their business, as they ridiculously called it, didn't make a cent. But they didn't need to make money. They were born rich. Their needless enterprise consisted of taking people to the wilderness and creating for them the sensation that they were lost there. They also took people shooting down rapids and frail rafts or canoes, creating for them the sensation that they would surely be bashed to death before they drown. Winkles were in the business of manufacturing sensations for people who were so removed from any sensations of their own making or circumstances that only high but simulated adventure could provoke any response from them at all. Dr. Larch was not impressed with Winkle's business. He knew that they simply were rich people who did exactly what they wanted to do, needed to call what they did something more serious sounding than play. What impressed Larch with the Winkles was that they were deliriously happy. Among adults and among orphans, Wilbert Larch noted that the delirious happiness was rare. In other parts of the world, Dr. Larch wrote, delirious happiness is thought to be a state of mind. Here in St. Clouds, we recognize that delirious happiness is possible only for the totally mindless. I would call it, therefore, the thing most rare, state of the soul. Larch was often facetious when he discussed the soul. He liked to tease Nurse Edna and Nurse Angela in the operating room, with the subject of the soul, catch the dear nurses off guard. Once with the body open on the table, Larch pointed dramatically to a smooth maroon shape beneath the rib cage and above the belly's viscera. It looked like a 3-pound loaf of bread, or a slug with 2 great lobes. Look, whispered. Rarely see it, but we've got it napping. Quickly before it moves. The nurses gaped. Soul, Larch whispered reverentially. In fact, it was the body's largest gland, hard with skills so also ascribed to the soul. For example, it could regenerate its own abused cells. It was the liver. Larch thought more of, he thought of the soul. But whether the delirious happiness of the Winkles was a state of mind or a state of the soul, Wilbur Larch wished that some of it could rub off on Homer Wells. The Winkles always wanted a child to share the world of nature with us, he said. And just to make a child happy, of course. Looking at them, Dr. Larch had his own ideas as to why they could not successfully breed. Lack of the essential concentration, Larch thought. Larch suspected that the Winkles never stopped moving long enough to mate. Perhaps he speculated, looking at Billy Winkle, she is not really a woman. Grant had a plan. He has no face, Dr. Larch noticed, trying to discern the man's blunt features. somewhere between his blond beard and his blonder hair. Hair was cropped in bangs, completely concealing a low forehead. The cheeks, what Larch could see of them, were a ridge, the eyes hidden behind them. The rest was a beard, blonde underbrush that Dr. Larch imagined Billy Winkle needed her machete to hack through. Grant's plan was that they borrow Homer for a little moose watching. The Winkles were going on a canoe trip and portaged through the northern state forest, principal fun of which was to see moose. Secondary pleasure would be introducing Homer Wells to a little whitewater. St. Larch felt that such a trip in the massive hands of the Winkles wouldn't be dangerous for Homer. He felt less sure that Homer would want to stay with these people, to be adopted by them. He hardly worried the Winkles' craziness would bother the boy, and it wouldn't have. What boy is troubled by perpetual adventure? What Wilbur Larch suspected was that the Winkles would bore Homer to tears, not to death. Camping trip in the state forest, white water now and then, a moose or two, might give the boy an idea of whether or not he could stand Grant and Billy forever. If you have a good time in the woods, Grant Winkle told Homer cheerfully, then we'll take you out on the ocean. Probably ride whales, Homer imagined. He teased sharks, Dr. Larch thought. Dr. Larch wanted Homer to try it, and Homer Wells was willing. He would try anything for St. Larch. Nothing dangerous, Larch said sternly to the Winkles. Oh no, cross our hearts, said Billy. Grant crossed his too. Dr. Larch knew there was only one road ran through the northern state forest. It was built by and remained the property of the Ramsey's Paper Company. They were not allowed to cut the trees in the state forest. They could not drive their equipment through it en route to the trees that were theirs. Only this, that Homer was going anywhere near where the Ramsey's Paper Company was operating, troubled Dr. Larch. Homer was surprised at how little room there was in the cab of the homemade safari vehicle that the Winkles drove. The equipment it carried was impressive: the canoe, the tent, the fishing gear, cooking miscellany, the guns. But there was little room for the driver and the passengers. In the cab, Homer sat on Billy's lap. It was a big lap, but strangely uncomfortable because of the hardness of her thighs. Homer had felt a woman's lap only once before, during St. Cloud's annual three-legged race. Once a year, the Boys and Girls Division amused the town with the race. It was a fundraiser for the orphanage, so everyone endured it. The last 2 years, Homer had won the race, only because his partner, the oldest girl in the girls' division, was strong enough to pick him up and run with him in her arms across the finish line. The idea was that a boy and a girl of comparable age fastened his left leg to her right. They then hopped toward the finish line on each of their free legs, dragging the miserable so-called third leg between them. The big girl from the girls' division hadn't needed to drag Homer. She cheated, she just carried him. Last year she had fallen at the finish line, pulling Homer into her lap. Her mistake trying to get out of her lap, he put his hand on her, and she sharply pinched what the private school boy in Waterville had caused back. Her name was Melanie, which was like several of the orphans' names in the girls' division. Typographical error. Melanie's name had been officially Melody. The girls' division secretary was a terrible typist. The mistyping was a fortunate mistake, because there was nothing melodious about the girl. She was about 16. No one really knew her exact age. And there was in the fullness, or in the roundness of her, very much the suggestion of Melons. The long red nose Homer worried that Billy Winkle might pinch him too. He watched the houses disappear. Farm animals, other cars, and trucks were gone from the roads. Soon it was just a road, a single road. Most often ran along the water. The water ran fast. Battery. Long time. Hold on, guys. I think I have time. Of you guys. Keep an eye on the battery. Okay. Ahead of them, for hours it seemed, loomed a mountain that had snow on the top, although it was July. The mountain had an Indian name. That's where we're going, Homer, Grant Winkle told the boy. Just under all that snow, there's a lake. Moose are crazy about the lake, Billy told Homer. You'll be crazy about the lake, too. Homer didn't doubt it. It was an adventure. Dr. Larch had told him he didn't have to stay. The Winkle stopped for the night before it got dark. Between a single road and rushing water, pitched a tent with 3 rooms in it. He lit a cook stove in one of the rooms, and Billy did 100 sit-ups in another room. 4 feet. Grant caught some trout. It's such a cool evening, there weren't any bugs. Kept the lamps running long after dark. Tent flaps open. Grant and Billy told adventure stories. His journal Dr. Larch would later write. What the hell else would they tell? Grant told about the 60-year-old lawyer who had hired them to show him a bear giving birth. Billy showed Homer her bear scars. And then there was the man who had asked the Winkles to cast him adrift at sea in a small boat, with only 1 oar. The man had been interested in the sensation of survival. He wanted to see if he could find his way back to land. He wanted the Winkle to observe him and rescue him. He was getting into real trouble. Rick, who that, was not letting the man know he was being observed. At night, when the fool fell asleep and drifted farther out to sea, the Winkles would cautiously tow him toward shore. In the morning, once, even within sight of land, the man always found a way to get lost again. Finally had to rescue him when they caught him drinking salt water. He'd been so disappointed, he gave them several bad checks before he finally paid his adventure fee. Adventure fee was Billy's name for it. Homer thought it might make his would-be adopted parents self-conscious if he told them the stories about life at St. Cloud's, or worse, about Thanksgiving in Waterville. He felt he had to contribute to something to the campfire spirit of his present adventure. Only good stories he knew were Great Expectations and David Copperfield. Dr. Larch had let him take a copy of Great Expectations with him, Homer's favorite of the two. Homer asked the Winkles if he could read them a little of his favorite story. At time. 5 more pages. Of course, they said they'd love it. They'd never been read to. Not that they could remember. Homer was a little nervous. Many times as he'd read Great Expectations, he never read aloud to an audience before. But he was wonderful. He even mastered what he guessed was Joe Gargery's accent. By the time he got to the part where Mr. Wopsle cries out, "No!"